Why is it that we associate the moral life with being a weird Ned Flanders-ish character? Welcome back to the Philosophy of Ethics. This video starts to bring us to present-day utilitarianism. At the time of this video, Peter Railton is an active professor of philosophy at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and most of his current work is partnered with psychologists and artificial intelligence experts. This video will specifically cover his article, Alienation, Consequentialism, and the Demands of Morality. I'll usually refer to this as simply alienation. It might be useful to first connect Railton to the philosophers we've already discussed. Utilitarianism starts with Bentham, and his most immediate successor is John Stuart Mill. There are major differences between them, so they represent two distinct versions of utilitarianism. Philosophers like Sidgwick explicitly follow Bentham and reject Mill, and other consequentialists like More ultimately left utilitarianism, yet are still primarily influenced by these philosophers. For the purpose of simplicity, we're going to place Railton in Mill's camp. Just like Mill, Railton uses human psychology to his advantage in advocating for his position, as well as refining it to make his particular sophisticated version. The next utilitarian we'll cover is Peter Singer, who I'll place in the other camp. Railton starts his article with two examples of relationships. John and Anne are married, and John is asked about the extraordinary quality of John's relationship with Anne. John responds, "I've always thought that people should help each other when they're in a especially good position to do so. I know Anne better than anyone else does, so I know better what she wants and needs. Besides, I have such affection for her that it's no great burden. Instead, I get a lot of satisfaction out of it. Just think how awful marriage would be, or life itself, if people didn't take special care of the ones they love." Lisa and Helen are friends, and Lisa is just getting out of a rough patch of her life. Helen was a particularly helpful and reliable friend throughout this difficult period. Lisa is expressing gratitude to Helen, and Helen responds, "You don't have to thank me, Lisa. You deserved it. It was the least I could do after all you've done for me. We're friends, remember? And we said a long time ago that we'd stick together no matter what. Someday I'll probably ask the same thing of you, and I know you'll come through. What else are friends for?" What's missing? First, John's response is intentionally more consequentialist, and Helen's is more concerned with duty, reciprocity, and respect, which are stereotypical of deontology. That's a competing ethical system that's going to be later in this series. Both John and Helen are aware of morality. Both did right to their friends. Neither is self-centered. Neither is emotionless. The place to look is not so much at what they say as what they don't say. I've displayed John's response again for reference. The response does accurately say why it's good to care for special people in your life, but what's missing is that this response isn't about Anne. Pieces that we miss are lines like, "She's my wife," "It's Anne," "I love her," or "She's special to me." Those responses would show that Anne herself is the direct motivation for his benevolence. Instead, it looks like the direct motivation is the desire for the world to be a happier place. The same can be said for Lisa and Helen's conversation. Helen's response doesn't say that Lisa is special. She instead speaks of the friendship almost like a contract, where the main detriment to failing is the dishonor that breaking her word would bring. The direct motivation isn't Lisa herself, but instead the direct motivation is a concern for what is deserved, what is promised, and what is expected. John and Helen's expressions are alienated. Alienation in ethics is an estrangement between their affections and their rational, deliberative selves. This means John and Helen absolutely feel that their wife or friend is special, but for whatever reason, their responses distance that fact from their moral point of view. It is as if the world were for them a fabric of obligations and permissions in which personal considerations deserve recognition only to the extent that, and in the way that, such considerations find a place in this fabric. In other words, it's as if morality itself is a filter for even their most special relationships. It might be true that John and Helen could have fuller relationships without alienation, but is this simply what morality is? Is morality supposed to be impersonal? One could say that John and Helen show no moral defect in thinking so impersonally, although they do moralize to excess. Railton is proposing that alienation is a moral defect. And Railton is not the first with this point of view. He quotes Consequentialism, saying, "Morality is made for man, not man for morality." The contrary position is attributed to Rawls. Purity of heart would be to see clearly and act with grace and self-command from this, that is, the perspective of eternity's point of view. Whether or not morality requires alienation, if alienation is problematic for morality, it would radically change how we discuss ethics. Rather than answer the question immediately, Railton thinks that a slight detour is helpful for context. The paradox of hedonism is that in acting like a hedonist, you're not likely to actually make yourself happier. The hedonist, looking around him, may discover that some of those who are less concerned with their own happiness than he is, and who view people and projects less instrumentally than he does, actually manage to live happier lives than he, despite his dogged pursuit of happiness. The paradox is that the hedonist, seeking pleasure, ought not to be a hedonist in order to achieve the goal of pleasure. An example, let's say you're a waiter, and at least in the US, a waiter makes most of their money through tips. So, as a waiter, you might be incentivized to hunt for tips. However, if your customers can tell that you're only there for tips, do you think that you'll be paid more or less? Clearly, the answer is less. Waitstaff get paid the best tips whenever the interaction feels like the waiter isn't depending on your generosity at the end of the night. So you have a paradox. Your goal is to be paid, but you can't act like you want to be paid. Maybe a more relevant example, if a YouTuber asks you to like and subscribe constantly, always pushes some third-party promotion, doesn't provide enough real content, constantly leaves you on cliffhangers, etc., how likely are you to stay engaged? You're likely to notice and bail immediately. Railton thinks the best way to solve this paradox is to distinguish between the two parts. Subjective hedonism is the view that one should adopt the hedonistic point of view in action. That is, that one should, whenever possible, attempt to determine which act seems most likely to contribute optimally to one's happiness, and behave accordingly. Objective hedonism is the view that one should follow that course of action which would in fact most contribute to one's happiness, even when this would involve not adopting the hedonistic point of view in action. And most importantly, sophisticated hedonism is when you successfully ditch subjective hedonism whenever it conflicts with objectively achieving the most happiness. Railton's example is a professional tennis player. The player is looking to improve his game, and the advice given to him is to stop focusing on winning and play the game for fun. So the tennis player starts to intentionally enjoy the game, whether he wins or loses, and his performance improves. His mindset has changed from "I must win," and the result is that he actually starts to win more games. The objective goal is to win games, but concentration on that goal can be its own roadblock. The same can be said about hedonism and friendship. The hedonist doesn't need to constantly think about the pleasure gained from a friendship, or even understand his friendship in those terms. That friendship might, and often does, produce more happiness than the friendship built on hedonism. So, for Railton's conclusion, he argues that alienation might be required for non-consequentialists, but for a utilitarian like himself, he can minimize alienation to only when it's beneficial. Sometimes distance is appropriate, but removing the filter itself also seems to be able to bring certain types of value into human life. Instead of viewing morality as an alienating filter for behavior, Railton and other utilitarians can view their psychology as the filter to how they approach life. This means the filter can be as thick or as thin as it needs to be to provide maximum value. Railton's utilitarianism allows for the flexibility needed to embrace the moral life without ever having to give up the other real human values, and this flexibility is more valuable in ethics than many of the armchair philosophers would admit. Practically, this means that John can care for Anne as a special person and admit it. Simultaneously, it is perfectly in line with the utilitarian goal of making the world a happier place. In fact, John's treatment of Anne as a special person above others is precisely what makes the world a happier place. Thanks for watching.